So hello, I'm Teresa Sobieschuk. I'm glad to welcome you to another in our series of International Development Studies speakers. This is the first term that we've been offering this lecture series, and we're delighted to have various people, both from the community and from other communities, and from University of Montana, and some people who aren't from University of Montana, to speak with us. So today we have Madhu Jagdishan, who's a PhD candidate at University of Montana in the anthropology department. And she's also an expert in monitoring and evaluation. She's been working in various organizations to deal with monitoring and evaluations, including Tata Institute of Social Sciences, the Magic Bus, India Foundation, Under the Mango Tree, and Friends of Women World Banking in India. And so we're so excited to have her. She already has her Master's of Philosophy degree. She's got a multidisciplinary gender studies degree from the University of Cambridge. And she's a trained social worker, and she graduated with that degree from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in India. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Madhu. And Madhu, do you mind if we interrupt you if we have questions? Is that okay?
It's perfect.
Okay, so we're going to speak loudly so we can be heard on TV. Thank you so much.
Also, please stop me if you can't understand my accent or what I'm saying. So, because I also have a tendency to talk really fast with an Indian accent, which is going to be hard.
So I'll raise my hand if you're going too fast.
So just stop me then. So, yeah. Hi, good evening. And before I start, I want to ask you all, why are you here? Like, what is it about me that you want to do? Or what is it about monitoring and evaluation that you know, or you think it's worth it that we're sitting here? Is this relevant? Why are we here?
Well, some people, of course, are here because this is a class and they needed to graduate. So they may not have known about the monitoring and evaluation, but they're here because they needed the class.
I'm not a community person, but I've done international monitoring and evaluation, and I would hear what you have to say.
Well, I'm just sort of curious how you would create a basis for feminist evaluation, considering cultural differences and different values within cultures and societies. And I don't know how somebody would go about doing that kind of monitoring while keeping in mind the cultural values.
I don't know if I want to address that completely, but if you think it's not addressed, just let's get back to that in the lab.
And you're willing to meet with us later if you
Yep.
still have remaining questions. This is a huge topic.
Yeah. Do you think it's relevant in development study? We're talking about international development. Is this relevant? Why were you in class?
She's nodding.
I think so.
Yeah. Why is it relevant? Not putting you in a spot if you don't want to inspire.
I mean, there's certainly different measures for development, and I think so much maybe it's focused on numbers and GDP measurements, but I think if it doesn't always reveal the inequalities that can happen, and so I think in order to have true development, it's got to be across the board.
And of course, we have to know what's going on with our programs or projects to know if they're helping, or if they could actually be causing problems and you want to stop the project. But you want to know so that you can continue things that are working well, or adjust things, or maybe even discontinue things if they're not working well, right?
Just skip class.
Oh,
I'm going to skip class. But yeah, I think pretty much that's what we're talking about when we're talking about monitoring and evaluation in development. With Teresa and, I don't know what your name is. What's your name?
Emily?
What Emily and Teresa were talking about measurements that guide us and guide us in various levels. So it's just not about GDP and nations, but talking about how does it guide us in our program, in what we're doing as development practitioners, in what we're aiming to do. Is this actually going on course? Am I going to fall? How will I know this data unless if I look constantly at what I'm doing? So am I addressing what I came to address? Inequities, vulnerability, marginalization. Am I talking about it? Or am I just there but having fun, but nothing is happening. So that's what your data talks about precisely. So then what is monitoring in that? What do you think is monitoring?
Keeping track of what's happening over the course of time. Are they on track? Are they moving as they're supposed to move? What have they run into? What problems have they run into? Barriers?
Everyone's fine with that? Somebody wants to add something?
Well, I can add something to that. So for me, but maybe I'm completely wrong, but for me, monitoring is something that you do really consistently, like maybe monthly or quarterly or yearly, really more consistently. Evaluation, sometimes you'll have a kind of big team that comes in and does an evaluation of a project, sometimes midstream, sometimes at the end of the project, so it's a bigger piece. They kind of can relate to each other, but the evaluation sometimes I think could be a bigger chunk of it than monitoring would be kind of the daily or weekly or monthly activity reports.
Yeah.
I also kind of see it as a twofold system. So it's the time period certainly is very valuable, as well as the quantitative and qualitative aspects of it. So you want to be able to talk personally and sort of really understand the issue. Because perhaps you're measuring this, but instead you should be measuring a different variable. And so that the quantitative is very important, but then also the qualitative, the hard data and making the graphs is also important for funding and as well as like being able to measure what you're trying to achieve.
Fair. Any more ideas? So I think you pretty much have it. So I'm just going to sum up what they talked about. But as the term tells, monitoring is about tracking progress, change at different levels. So it's about looking at tracking about, is the objective of why I'm here, what I'm doing, is that being achieved? And to see in the larger term of what I wanted to achieve in the larger progress of development, what is it happening? So it might be something like Teresa just gave you all a sheet to sign up, which was also monitoring to see who and all is here, because without people here, this lecture series is not going to happen. But it also means that is the person talking, what the lecture is about is actually adding to the discourse of what you're talking about in development. So she's monitoring us in multiple ways in that sense, like you said. And she's doing it periodically. So monitoring by default has to be done periodically. The periodicity can differ and you can vary according to how you want to develop it. So it can be weekly, it can be monthly, it can be quarterly, but there has to be periodicity. And by default, as we're saying, it's about programs, it's about tracking change. It has to be done by someone who's running the program. Like it has to be done by her. I can't come and track because I'm an outsider. I really don't know what I'm doing, what she's doing, what's her plans for the whole lecture series. I really don't know. So it's always done by someone who's in-house, who's running the program. And that's very critical for monitoring to happen. So if that's monitoring, then what's evaluation? Though she did tell us one point about evaluation, that it happens one-off.
Or just
Yeah.
bigger times.
Bigger times. What else can evaluation be?
Well, if monitoring is in-house, could evaluation, sometimes I'm imagining it could be in-house, but sometimes you would hire outside evaluators to come in, and take a look at your project and program to see it more overall. And sometimes if you're working in your project, you might be so close and so deeply vested that you can't give a good critique of it because you're just so invested in it. So it's nice to have outside people come in and sometimes and give you their point of view and their perspective.
Right.
Sometimes you need outside people in monitoring also.
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
Not just inside.
Why would you say that? Just for the others.
Because sometimes they don't get off the dime, and things, first year goes by, and they're still trying to get personnel hired, and they're busy, but nothing's happening at the point of the project.
Or you could be so invested in the project that you want to make your project look good, so like, is there ever the case where people lie about the data and they report all this stuff that's going on that really isn't going on, so.
So you mean to say external someone for checking it, to see that it's happening and moving. but the process of monitoring invariably is in-house. It might have someone external who's supporting it. That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah,
Fair.
I
Totally fair.
support it, yes.
So yeah, any other ideas on evaluation that you want to add on, don't want to add on? You go through evaluation. We're in university, we all do, don't we?
Oh, I have to do that every term. I'm waiting for papers. Please turn in some papers for me so I can evaluate them.
So evaluations, even when you're looking at it, even if you think of it, just think of when I'm in university, I'm turning in papers. Why are we doing that? It's about, have I achieved what I want to achieve at that point of time? So evaluation always has a time period, and it's never done immediately. So I want to do an evaluation today, and I'm not going to do an evaluation tomorrow, because the level of knowledge, level of change is going to be the same. So evaluation, first of all, is done, like Teresa was saying, at a time point. It's as of today, as of tomorrow, as of October. It's done, it can be done externally, and there's always greater validity if it's done externally, but that does not mean that evaluation doesn't happen in-house also. But there might be bias, there might be issues. And evaluation never happens standalone. Your monitoring speaks to your evaluation, like she was talking. That's why it's very good if you have someone external, or your evaluator is in the process from the very beginning, who's also looking in, because the monitoring data should speak to the program, but it also should speak to the larger objective, and how do you know you're going there or not. So evaluation that way has multiple roles that it plays. And you can have 3 types of evaluations broadly. You have evaluations in the beginning of a program, which is the formative evaluation that gives you what is it at that point of time. You can have something that's called the midterm evaluation. So if you have a 5-year program, I'll do it around my 2.5, 3 years round. And it's also called the developmental evaluation. And you have evaluation that happens right at the end, which is a summative evaluation, or the end-line evaluation as is popularly used in the sector, the term. And that might not happen if it's a 5-year program on the 5th year, but it might happen between the 5th and the 6th year, because you also give it time sometimes for the program to breathe, and then you go to evaluate. So if you actually look at the difference between monitoring and evaluation, this is the difference. So monitoring data does speak to evaluation, but monitoring data standalone also helps a program. Your monitoring data has to be used by the program people, otherwise it's just data which is there. So your monitoring data is useful for course correction, like Emily was talking about, to tell you, are you going in that direction that you want to go to? Is this working, not working? Is there something happening that I didn't realize? So in a class of 10 students, I have a problem with one person who's not mixing with the 9 others. I think it's only in my class, so I just talk to that girl. But then all of us here realize that in all our classes this is happening. How do we get to know that? Only through our monitoring data, which tells me that, oh, one girl is not mixing with others. Then we realize it's actually 20 of them who are not mixing with the other 100. Then it's an issue you have to address. And then you realize, when you start looking at who are these 20 children, you realize they live in some village which is about 2 hours away from where the school that you are teaching in. Then you realize that they really don't know each other, and you have not created that space. So if you have to be effective, you have to be able to capture all these small details in your monitoring data and be able to see it across your program, to analyze it, and then to see what does it mean to my program. So that's what your monitoring data does. Whereas your evaluation data, though it does speak to your program, the understanding of evaluation is not assessment. It's about understanding what is it that we achieved? Why did we do what we did? What was the change that happened or didn't happen? And why did it happen? And what has happened that I didn't expect it to happen? And what does this mean to the larger discourse in development? And this is data that you're looking at strongly so for learning and knowledge building, and not as assessment that this worked or didn't work. Because that's not the question over here. Yeah, so as we're talking, evaluations by experts, consultants is what is preferred usually. But they don't do it standalone. They do it with the team in-house. So you don't have an expert who comes and does an evaluation saying, I'll just go talk to the community, I'm going back. Because evaluation doesn't happen like that. You also have to talk to the group who worked with the team talk to them together, look at what is it that they have to say. Sometimes there'll be stuff that, data that they have captured, which maybe they were biased. They looked at it saying that, oh, I prefer to look at it this way. Whereas an evaluator, being external, can see biases like that. In that process, also teach the organization that maybe this doesn't work, you need to look at it this way. So the evaluation also needs to speak back to the organization. And it's a more holistic process in that, which is why you tend to use the term together, monitoring and evaluation. But they stand alone. Any questions? Anything someone wants to add that I missed? Sure, move ahead. What is this I had? So, why do we need, like, did this just emerge all of a sudden? Or where did it come from, M&E? Why do we need, like, M&E is monitoring and evaluation? Clear? Like, that's the term you'd hear everywhere in the development sector. So why do we need M&E? And where did this need emerge from in the sector? Any ideas? Okay. So, like we were talking about in evaluation, there was a need felt in the late 70s, 80s. That's when you see the expansion of M&E sector, and it becoming formalized as a system that's used across. And this happened with a larger emphasis on accountability. So you're accountable to your community, accountable to your development goals, you're accountable to your objectives that you want to reach, as well as looking at learning. What is it that I can learn that can be replicatable in other places, that can be taken off, adapted so that we can learn off from each other? So you see M&E coming in from there. And which is why, as a discourse, it was very largely funder-driven. So if I want to have these conversations, means I have to start talking about M&E from the time I start planning or thinking of a project. And everyone who's as a development professional over here, you might be teaching, you might be a volunteer, but you start thinking, how am I going to assess this? How am I going to track this progress that I want to achieve? If in a school I want to create, I'm going there as a volunteer who's teaching English in Bombay slums, how do I know that children over there are learning or not? So from the time you start thinking of your curriculum, you start planning of what kind of course you will do with them, what activities you'll teach them, you start thinking, how do I know they understood this or not? How do I know if they got it? How do I know they're finding it fun or not, or they're finding it boring? Like, you must be thinking, okay, if you realize why I keep asking you questions is the way I monitor. Am I boring? Does this work, not work? Is this just like me going on and on and on? Or is it making sense to you? So that's the way I'm monitoring my own progress to what I decided I'm going to do. So we all start, when did I decide I'll ask these questions? When she told me that, will you do this? And I was like, do you mind if I have a discussion? So it started in the very planning stage. And that's very critical for M&E to work. So given that it's in the planning stage, and given that development projects just don't happen like that, you generally write a grant, a proposal, ask for money for it. M&E is a core component over there. So in the 70s and 80s when M&E came, it was largely funder-driven. Funders understood the need to make organizations start thinking more structurally in that sense. And so it wasn't very well taken, honestly, and still there are a lot of issues on it. But I think what we can say now in the last 10 to 20 years is that as a subject, M&E is looked at as something that you can use in-house. So there's greater acceptability of it, and the nature of accountability and understanding of accountability vis-a-vis M&E to funders has changed quite a bit. Would you agree?
Oh, yeah. Okay, I worked in the State Department in the early 90s. We were just introducing the concept of having goals for a project that you could actually measure, like just even in the 90s. It's like, oh my gosh, it took us this long to get this. And so I just remember trying to lead people through, well, we can't set up monitoring and evaluation until you know what your goals are. And so can you think of some goals? And yeah, it was very interesting. So
Yeah.
very funder-driven, and sometimes it's kind of top-down, but now I think I agree with you, it's very accepted and widely used.
And actually, though it is there is a big movement even within the development sector that let's not look at it as a standalone department, but include it into your entire process. So you might be a volunteer by default, you actually, even as a volunteer, you're actually doing monitoring. The data doesn't come from somebody sitting in the office saying that ABC happened, but actually it comes from the person who's implementing it. So a development professional of any kind across the world, you're doing it by default. So it's best that we all understand what we're doing and be a part of the process that you're doing. So, because it helps you to stay at course and move ahead. So in that sense, yeah, the discourse has shifted a lot. So interesting is you were talking to me about it. I think we were talking about how, I don't know, Gigi was talking about students interning a year abroad or one semester abroad, right? Do you think at that point of time you would be doing anything that we discussed till now? Monitoring, evaluating, interning? If you're actually thinking of it, you would be doing a lot of that. You would be the one who's actually monitoring your progress there, and you'll be reporting it back to your supervisor here. You would be the one sitting with them to evaluate your progress, or what you learned or didn't learn, what was your learning, what do you want to do different next time. So in that sense, it's actually something we all are doing very regularly. It's just that we don't realize we are doing it, but we're actually doing it. There's nothing new in anything I'm going to say ahead.
We do this because we count up how many people came to our activity, who participated, how many activities we held, right? So we're making the tallies, and of course we don't want to know just how many activities we held, but what was the quality, and maybe we pass out evaluation forms and have people rate, and so then we have that information we could add to our monitoring. So yeah, we do this all the time.
And actually the best part is you would write all those forms, and the best monitoring that happens, like you were talking about qualitative monitoring, is when you're filling up the forms, you have those conversations saying, oh, I did this, but maybe I should have done that, and that would have been better. And so you're assessing your own progress in that. And that's also a feature of monitoring, and that's the best feature if you could do that. So, yep. So just moving ahead, I'm just going to talk about two really large frameworks. And what I'm doing actually through this 1 hour is introduce the major concepts. Because if you're comfortable with a few of the major concepts, what it means, you'll be pretty comfortable in reading any kind of M&E document, and you'll know what it is. So, and one of the biggest frameworks in which is the most popular in the M&E world, and which is used across, I think anyone in the sector knows this, is the causal framework, where you understand change vis-a-vis causation, vis-a-vis access, and saying, I'm addressing this problem that caused it, so now development or change will happen. So it's a very structured way. And causal frameworks is largely influenced from and actually came out of something that's called logical framework analysis, or log frame. And it's like anyone and everyone uses it, and everyone knows it. And that's like the basis of your M&E. So what we'll be talking about later, which is what we're talking about more qualitative, where you have people accepting it, is also a fallout of the critique that happened to this framework, because this was the base. So, and just some trivia, because I really like knowing where things come from. It's really interesting to trace the origins of logical framework. It actually came from the US military in the 50s and the 60s. And it's superbly interesting because the military was using log frame, which was picked up by NASA, who used it. And then in the 70s, 80s, it was USAID. I don't know if you've heard. It's one of the biggest it's US aid agency, right? Agency, okay. US aid agency, which is USAID, which was at that time pretty much one of the biggest funders and one of the biggest international development organization working in the field of HIV and AIDS. And they picked it up in the late 70s, 80s, and thereafter, seeing the utility of it at that point of time, it was picked up by a whole range of international development organizations. So the nature of how it understands causation and development is also influenced from the history it comes from. But it's been interesting, and you'll see later, is the way it gets adapted and the way we can change and play around with it, which is very interesting. So have any of you heard of log frame? or logical framework analysis in any other field because it draws a lot from a lot of other fields. Okay, great. This is my favorite part. Okay, so what is log frame? It is super simple logic. Like, you won't find it more simpler than this. So basically, I say, so I am in this is my, should I call it kingdom or a village? What do you prefer? Huh? Village. Okay, you're my village. And I see that a couple of people are hungry. So I decide I'm going to give you rice, I'm going to give you a few vegetables, and I'm giving you a kitchen. You're going to cook food over there. Food is cooked. Okay? Now, it's my village. Some people are hungry. You don't mind, right, being hungry? Okay. So I decide I come and offer her the food. Would you take it?
Yes.
Okay, thank God. She had said no, I've been a problem. So she takes the food and she eats. So she's not hungry anymore. Fair? Logic is fine with anyone. Is there any problem with this? Fine? So I'm giving her this food every day. So I'm saying after 4 years, she's a healthy individual because now she's getting nutritious food, good food, cooked by someone I know really well who's cooking it well, and she's eating regularly. It's fine? That's exactly for your logical framework. I gave you the raw ingredients, you cook them, you get food. I give you food, your stomach is full, this continues over a long period of time, nutrition improves. So you say, this is the input, that's an activity or a process I do it, which gives me the output, which is the food. And then I offer her the food. So why is this? I'm assuming she's going to accept it. That means that I'm assuming she has the knowledge that this is food, which will fill her up. I'm assuming that she is going to like it. She'll eat it continuously. So I get an outcome, which is actually change in knowledge or attitude. Because before she wasn't doing that, right? Now she's doing it. And the impact is when you do assume and they continue doing the same outcome. So what you have is a change in behavior, a structural change, that is. That's what you're talking about as impact. These are like the common definitions, though I have to caution you, the M&E world is as schizophrenic as any other world, and people like exchanging definitions. So I've given you the common definitions. But so you have the outcome, which is change in behavior, attitude and knowledge, and you have your impact, which is change in behavior. And so just to make things a bit clearer, your input always comes out to your output. So your output has to be something always tangible, like the food I gave you. So it's always going to be something that's also measurable in some way, quantifiable in some way. And your outcome would not be always quantifiable, but you can always relate it back to your output. You know it's because of this that it came. Whereas your impact can be because of many factors. So maybe there was a health dispensary that started giving folic acids over there and iron supplements over there, which was why she got more nutritious. Maybe rice was, and I was giving just one vegetable, which was not actually giving her the vitamins and minerals. But so your impact can have multiple factors. And it's not always in your control, because the gestation period for it is much longer. But in log frame, the understanding is when I keep repeating this outcome again and again and again and again, that's when this impact comes. And that's also going to be one of its biggest critiques, that's why. So, any questions? So yeah, I'm sorry, just on the input point, which I forgot, is your input can be of various kinds. It can be even human resources, your finances that you put in. So it can also be the volunteers you get, all of that would come there. Any questions on these 5 concepts? You're pretty much then there in M&E world, technically. So because this, from input to your output, and to a certain level, your immediate outcomes are under your control. The input, output, and your activities are totally under your control because you're doing it, so you monitor that, always. And your outcomes as we were saying, some of it is within your control. So I can see if she's eating or not every day, which is under your control. Yeah, but I can't decide her nutrition. Maybe she has a childhood problem of underweight and low nutrition. Then as an adult, even if I give her, her nutrition level is not going to come up that easily. So your impact is not always in your control, but it gets influenced by it. So what you generally evaluate, as we were saying, your objectives, right? That's your outcome and your impact. That's what you evaluate. If you put what we were talking about, monitoring and evaluation before together. Questions? Anything you want to add?
That's very useful to see the, monitoring and evaluation overlaid on that.
Thank you. And do you think I was just making up this example? This is like this example that I just gave you is one of the biggest projects. The logic behind one of the biggest projects, not projects, it's actually the government-run program in whole of Asia, which is run in India, which is called the Midday Meal Program, which started in 1995. And the midday meal program, the logic of it is exactly this. Because in India you have a lot of low birth weight and you have a lot of nutrition issues, the government of India first piloted it in 2 states, and now it's a running program, wherein you have locally sourced, nutritious, basic raw ingredients given to a school, every government school in the area. There's a kitchen which is provided by the government. The government gets a local woman who is generally a widow or a single woman who runs the kitchen or SHG groups. Every day she cooks food over there, and all the children eat their lunch in school. And the understanding of this is that then the children's nutritional levels will go up. So all children between 6 and 14, and there's a similar program for those between 0 and 6 years also. And this is run, and this is the logic behind it. And it's pretty successful in some ways. There are issues, but it's still, like some of what it wants to attain is not attainable, but on level of regularity of having food intake, which other children used to not have because they don't have a breakfast system over there, and generally they don't have food. So they eat 1.5 meals a day in the rural areas. So for them, 1 meal is ensured. Yep.
I have a question. So is there a fear that it's going to create dependency? And if so, say children's health goes up, then do funders then suddenly start, decreasing the amount they're willing to give, and then it becomes more of a problem?
Okay, that's one of the big critiques of LogFrame. But yeah, one is that with respect to this particular program, it's not dependency. It's to reduce nutritional deficiency and to address an immediate solution. But the critique of LogFrame in itself, or all the causal framework, which I was going to do a little later, is that it does not answer structural problems. What you're looking at is saying that A is a problem, so I'm just doing this. It becomes Band-Aid solutions. And what are you not answering is why are they poor? Why is it that the child does not have food at home? Why is it that the child has to come to school to have food? What about the parents who are not having food then? And what about children who are over 14 years of age? So when you're 14, you don't need food anymore after 14, because it's from 6 to 14, and that's what the Act says. So it doesn't answer those questions, like you said. And on funder dependency, so generally, this is also a problem with this method, is that they assume that when you keep getting an impact, you've achieved change. And so they would say, we can withdraw or you expand, but in reality, it doesn't work that way. So there is a big critique that comes out on this, that this method doesn't work. But the problem is a lot of bilateral, multilateral agencies love LogFrame. And what we'll do after this, which is basically an extended model of LogFrame, which is called a result-based management. And as the term says, it mainly focuses on these 2 aspects, output and outcome, because that's what is measurable easily. And they ask you for quantifiable numbers on that. And they assume that if that and that is achieved, your impact is achieved. But so you're not making self-sufficient communities in independent communities. Self-dependent is independent. Independent communities, but creating dependent communities.
But part of what happens, and I watched it, is you feed the children, they come to school. And if they come to school, you've already made a step into bettering their world, because now they're learning something. You take away the food, they may not come. And I watched it. I even watched the parents come to eat with them, because they didn't have food either. But it makes their education, if that's where they're getting the food, it makes their education become a very positive thing. And they don't keep the children home to babysit. They don't keep them home to dig out the roots in the garden. They do send them to school. And I saw it and I watched it. And so that leads to the impact that often isn't measured. That's the piece that often stops at outcome, doesn't go to the impact.
I'm going to wait and then I want to respond to that because I have a few different thoughts on that. but also it worked because our governments are very smart. If we are like, we have this saying in Hindi that says, if you think you're 1.5 smart, our government is 2.5 smarter than you. So it's like that. So basically in schools, so keep them in school to eat, they would lock the gates. You're not allowed to leave school. You're supposed to come in the morning when attendance happens. And you stay the whole duration, and then you're, like when you eat lunch, and then after 1 hour, they jump the gates, otherwise they open it up. They can't keep them more than that. But the fact is that because of it, they make them come early and stay the whole time. Because of it, there's no child labor in that sense or looking after. But because it doesn't answer structural issues, we had problems of, for instance, bad input coming in. So we had children like 100, 120, I should be saying this on camera. Anyway, 120 children getting hospitalized because the food was bad in just one school. So the problem is not actually even in the model. It's about how, like Emily pointed out, how do you understand change and how do I structure it? And where is the community in all of this, as we'll talk later about it. But that's what it is about. So as governments, as bilateral, multilateral agencies, this is a superbly useful method. Because for doing anything at that scale, this is very helpful a way to plan, to think, and to execute development. So yeah, we actually talked about this, so it's fine. Okay, I'm going to talk about another method, which is the theory of change, which is, like we were talking, like you pointed out, which steps back from logical framework a bit. It does look at stuff through causal analysis, but says, let's talk about a larger, what is it that I want to change? So what do I see in this world? So I'm going to use this, these guys are my favorites, so I'm going to just use this example. So I'm just talking about how Under the Mango Tree as an organization looked at theory of change. So Vijaya, the founder, who's worked for about 20-25 years in multilateral and bilateral and local organizations across the country, and she was seriously concerned about agricultural productivity in India. And we have this a large number of marginal and small farmers, and our farming is also largely that. So it also meant that means you're talking about working with small and marginal farmers. How do you increase agricultural productivity was the question. The only way you can increase agricultural productivity is through pollination. And how do you pollinate is through bees. So she started looking at, and what the method of beekeeping that's done in India is largely where you import the European bee, Mellifera, and as you know here, you have vast open lands. In India, it's not like that. We don't have that vast. And this is a migratory bee. So basically, it doesn't work in our country. And we get this, and people just go in loss. So she said, no, let's work with Apicera indica, which is a local indigenous bee, which doesn't need migration, which is from our area. So then they started beekeeping with small and marginal farmers as a plan. They said, let's do this, this will work. I do that, they get honey, and let's source honey from them also. So they get additional livelihood, which gives them the revenue that they need to put into agriculture. Because agriculture is also like, you all must be aware, you get money only one time, right? If you're two cropping, then you get it 2 times. But there's a long patch when you don't have money. And there's a lot of credit that happens because of that. And there still is a lot of farmer suicides that are happening because of that, because people don't have the money to do it. So they need money in between, and honey gives them money. So let's do that. By doing this, what am I doing? Increasing productivity, but that also means honey is there. The crops are going to be better. They're going to be better fruits, because the flora of one of the beekeeping is that. which means child nutrition in that area reduces. So when they started seeing these interlinkages, by looking at saying, I want to address this problem, this is for you the theory of change. If someone does this, this is your theory of change. It does look at causes and answering it, but it looks at it, as you said, in a larger framework of saying, how do I look at development? And because it's like this, okay, this is how I'm looking at it. I can adapt this to other frameworks very easily. I can say that, okay, I can put a log frame here saying that, okay, I'm putting in this input here, input there. What is the impact? Is farmers working? Am I earning the revenue of 500 crores that we need to run it? The way she wants to run it. So she could answer all of this by doing it. And the best part about theory of change is, I can do it, you can do it, you can sit with the community and do it. It's about just saying, what is it I want to do and how am I going to do it? And you don't have to write it in words. You can always do diagrammatic, and which is a very popular way of using theory of change as opposed to log frame, which is a very linear approach. So, any questions on theory of change? So it's generally, it just sums it up saying how you reflect about what you want to do in a context, you talk about a population you want to do it with, about how am I going to learn from it, and what are the challenges, the complexity of change, because you're not looking at a very linear change here. You know how one feeds into the other, and helps you look at it in multiple ways, and look at your intervention in multiple ways. I'm not moving like a bus from one stop to the other, but I can dance over there, literally. So lets you do that, theory of change. So the critique, as I was talking, and I'm just going to run over this quickly, is that because of the fact of causal network being very linear, there is a tendency to more look at accountability and less towards learning. Though that's what it aims to do. And you were just pointing out, many a time we forget the impact. And what is it I'm getting from the impact? So the impact just says, did the amount of resources I put in, did I get enough out of it because of that? Or what did I learn from it? Okay. So for instance, if I was going to ask you, there was, this is a story. This is a case, so I'm not making it up. So in interior Rajasthan, a worker over there says he was in a village and he got 16 girls to sign up for school. The school dropouts. And we have something in your 10th grade, you can give it from outside, like an external exam. You don't have to go to school. And he got them to sign up, 16 of them. It was a Friday, so he didn't go give the papers. On Monday, when he came back, all of them decided, I'm not going to do it. So in the end, when he looks at your output and outcome, it's a 0. So accountability-wise, it's a 0. But do you think it's a 0? Do you think there was any kind of work over there that would fit in this? If I was going to put in this input, activity, output, outcome, and impact.
Well, he shouldn't ask them on Friday and give them time to think it over, or he should give them time to think it over before they agree to do something. Should change the order a little bit.
So I guess the output would be figuring out what you should do in those situations to sort of rule out better approaches.
Any more ideas? Okay. I didn't tell you the whole story, honestly. He's been trying for the past 4 years to get them to sign up. The fact that they actually filled up the form meant that the idea he put in actually crystallized. That meant girls who never speak up in Rajasthan, where you still have the parda system, where you cover up your head, and there's very strong patriarchy with still high levels of child marriage. They actually got up, talked to their parents, even if it meant negotiating with their mother. They negotiated, filled up the forms. That meant the mother negotiating with the father, which meant the father agreeing and signing it, and which meant the girls actually went out of their house and gave him the form when he came in between the village at that time. And they thought about it. When we look at it in these boxes, because we already decided that the box that needs to be ticked is the fact that they got enrolled or didn't get enrolled, and we didn't give space for all these, which is learning. Maybe next time they would. But this is something they've never done before. And for him, that work, development practitioner, when he started reflecting back in that lens, it was quite something, because he himself felt that things didn't work out. And he's telling us 4 years, and then finally this happened, and we were like, what? But that's because we're not looking at this at all. And that's about structural change that you're talking about. So that is one of the biggest problems when you start looking at it from log frame. And that's been one of the biggest critique in feminist monitoring and evaluation. That they've been critiquing that we keep talking about the formal part. And we start measuring only the formal part of power and power structures. There's been much more critiques, but this is the biggest one. They're saying the kind of power structure in the domains of the informal, we're not looking at that or talking about it. So if I'm talking about why are girls not able to access, we're not talking about that. Because that's hard to measure, right? Once you start talking about the informal. And then this is not sustainable change, just looking at the formal. And that's also been one of the biggest critique, that just because we're talking about development change, you start looking at all these small time changes as sustainable change, which is not. And so you need to really relook at what you're talking about change. And you need to relook and center power in it. And I'm running way out of time, so I'm going to run. Oh, I thought 10 minutes. Any questions? If somebody wants to add something to this before I run ahead.
Wait, so now we switch to feminist monitoring and evaluation.
I'm just critiquing the,
Okay.
causal analysis with the feminist lens. And if anyone's interested in monitoring feminist M&E, please look up Patliwala Pittman 2010. It's in the AWID website. It's one of the Bibles of feminist M&E, and it's a really good book to read to understand how do you look at change and how do you look at development. So the feminist M&E also, so the feminist critique also is that, so how do we envisage and how do you start planning for change has to include within it informal structures. And for that to happen, it has to have conversation and inclusion of the community and the groups you're working with. Because a log frame by default is written in an office. How is the community going to know what input are you putting in? They don't know what resources you have. They don't know you've been funded 500 crores or 5 million. Only you know that. You're the one who've decided that, oh, they need this. So I need to get this money. So need a classroom here. And they need a toilet built, so I build the toilet. Should I go ask them, do they want a toilet? Is there water facility available? Who's building the toilet? Are you getting contractors from outside? Do they have a problem with the community that's coming in to build it? I never had these conversations with them. And that's the biggest critique of log frame. And that's the biggest critique. So you need to localize and get the community involved in it. And just a second. So how do you understand change? So the feminist critique has talked about change needs to be understood, which is more complex, which has a better political understanding of the socio-political situation. Because when we start talking about outcome, impact, and change, you start assuming a lot of things. Assumptions are very strong. And the assumption is done 5 and 6 years before. And you hardly ever go revisit and change it. Because if I revisit and change my assumption, I have to change my entire linear network. So I change my assumption in the output. That means my outcome and impact has changed. So for instance, I was talking to you about the school of India, of how the midday meal program. The assumption was that the school system would check the quality of the food that's being served. And that there will be something called a local SMC that we call School Management Committee, which will comprise of the leaders and local parents who will also check the quality, which initially happened amazingly well. But later, no one was checking the quality. So basically, you started getting really in bad quality food stuff, and which was why there was all those deaths as well as illness that happened among the children. So now if they were going to change that assumption, saying that the school is not checking, what about what follows after that? everything will have to change. And how do you assume something to be stable? It doesn't work like that, assumptions. So that has been the major problem. And also, so when it happens, so what is it that we measure? We always measure something that's positive, that's nice. Change is a perfect situation that you want to look at and you're like, everyone understood everything. And I ticked it off. We never capture negative change in log frame. We never capture things that don't work. So we say 40% understood. We didn't say 60% didn't understand it. And why didn't they? Sorry. So all of that is not captured. Sometimes it's also extremely expert-centric in the sense of who evaluates, who draws your monitoring framework. You always have someone external coming in and doing it for you. It's not localized, it's not the community, and it's not, it surely is not the group you're working with, which many a time is not the dominant group. So how do I understand the politics of that and see inclusion is actual inclusion and not just of certain groups? How do I reach the margins of the margins? Because that's where you want to go, and not just of the main groups. And as I was saying, the log frame which has evolved in the beginning, log frame which is there now, you adapt it, but it's pretty much the same. And there is hardly much space to say the reality in Nepal is different from the reality in Korea or in Japan. Maybe I need different models over there. Maybe even within India, when I look at every state is different. Rajasthan, which I was talking about, is so different from the state I come from, where we don't have those things that you cover. Patriarchy is understood very differently in Rajasthan as opposed to where I come from, which is Tamil Nadu. So how do I then adapt this for each state? Which log frame doesn't give you those spaces. So moving ahead, just to understand, so traditionally when you measure early child marriage, how do you generally, you've heard child marriage, right? You don't even usually measure it like that. Across GDP everywhere, number of girls who were not married or who were married before 18 years of age. Have you heard any other definition for child marriage? Any other way to measure child marriage?
Well, I was thinking 18 might be different depending on the society. So, 16 maybe would be appropriate in some societies and 18 not. Like in the US, some states allow marriage at 16 with parental consent. Like when is adulthood? By 18? Like we associate that with the right to vote. But it's not even the drinking age, so why didn't we make it 21? Or, why 18?
18, this comes from the CRC. This 18 is from the CRC. Because most, apart from the US and Sudan, like most other countries have ratified the Child Rights Convention, which talks about it as 18. Which is why it's the most used, it's one of the international indicators, as they like calling it, or international standards of measurement for child marriage, is that's why 18. So technically in India also, age of consent is 16. So before that it's statutory rape, but you wouldn't be, if you still want to stay in the marriage, it's still fine. Though it's not legal, but it's all those loopholes. But this is because of the CRC.
So that's a measure of success?
Yeah.
The number who married before?
So if it's lower, then it's a measure of success.
So you want to have low percentage or low number of girls married before 18.
So you compare it usually. This is how it's mostly measured.
It's written, it doesn't look that way. Number of not married before 18.
Low number of girls.
So generally it says percentage of girls who marry at 18 years, and which is like if it is 17, it's high. So then you want to move to 5. Because generally it's percentage of girls. But just try to make it less technical. But this is how you measure it. But this is how the community sought to measure it. When we asked them, what do you need to measure when you talk about early child marriage? This was a list that came out. So I'm just going to read this out because most of you can't read this, I presume, Hindi. I'm sorry, but I just didn't have the time to type it. So they're talking about independence, self-confidence. They're talking about Sashaktikarana, that's empowerment. They're talking about being able to question and challenge patriarchy. That's this, Pitrasata. Have a job, are able to go into education, have mobility, who view marriage as an option and not as a compulsion, when they have opportunities for jobs, they have a role model, when they understand better about honor, or izzat as you call it in Urdu, and when they understand equality, they say when all of this, and there's much, much more, which I'm not going on, when all of this happens, then you know they're ready for marriage. And this criteria is not valid. But you rarely go ask communities that, right? So actually the way communities understand change is much more complicated and complex. And it's very useful to go and ask them that. And from that comes another large framework, which is contribution, where you look at change happening through a complex process where many people have stakes and many people are doing multiple things for it to happen. So you're looking at who's contributing for what. You're not looking at you're costing it, but how much am I contributing towards it and understanding it. And so that's contribution analysis in short. Anyone wants to add something, want to ask something? I'm just stopping in between before moving ahead, because I've been going on. Fine? Want to add something?
Yeah, I'm just thinking, you don't want to hear.
So I'm just going to start off with something called outcome mapping. And outcome mapping is this really interesting method, which is now one of the biggest methods in contribution analysis. And one of the growing methods is where it looks at outcomes as changes in behavior, relationships, attitudes, or actions of the people who are concerned. So what it does means, in default, how they understand change is very complex. And it's very, very interesting. So in normal log frame, we're saying input, I give, because of which one output comes, right? And then there is a change that happens, which is sustained, which is an outcome, which is a change that happens first, which is sustained, becomes an outcome. It's very linear. And then when it consistently happens, it's impact. What outcome mapping says is that change doesn't happen like this. Change rather is a messy thing, which is really hard to plot like that. Like sometimes, for instance, they would come. The first day, there's a lot of people here. Maybe the next time she says, Madhu's coming, none of you come, and it's negative. And it's consistently negative. Then there's a new batch of people who hear and say, who the hell is she? Let's try it out. So then there's positive. Maybe they come the next time, and they like what's being spoken, then it goes really high. You really don't know what's going to happen. There's a lot of unexpected things happening. Sometimes there's some things that just happen randomly, so, and it also diverges. So there might be one group which went saying, I loved it. Another group which said, I hated it. So, and change so is not linear, and there's always one step forward, two steps back. There's always places for backlash, for reversal of what you didn't think will happen. Surprises happening, unanticipated, unexpected change, and all of that is what outcome mapping focuses on. So when in outcome mapping, what you look at and what you want to map is outcomes, changes in all of this, and not outputs and inputs. Because it's saying that doesn't matter. Maybe it was the fact that I came and offered her the food that made the difference. The fact that I belonged to a different caste or a higher caste, and she was for a lower caste. And the fact that this was the first time a higher caste person offered it to a lower caste person. And that's where the change happened, not in the food. Maybe this is the first time we got a lower caste person or a lower race person to sit and cook, which never happens otherwise. And that's where change happens for them. So that's what you're talking about as developmental change. It's not about how many classrooms I created or how many chairs I made, how many parents came to the school who never before came because they were themselves illiterate and were intimidated by the school. But given that the food was being served, like the way you said, and they came, that was a change in attitude, a relationship that changed. Outcome mapping says, let's track those changes. Let's be able to capture that. And let's capture it more holistically. So how do you do outcome mapping? And why do outcome mapping? Outcome mapping is essentially community-centric. It happens with the community doing it. You and I sitting here can't do anything with outcome mapping. And so what does it mean? It means I let the community decide what is it that they want to see in the world. And then they decide how is it I want to see. And then they would say, okay, I know who are the people who need to be changed because of this. Like when they define how do you measure early child marriage, if you remember before, they talked about self-confidence, about mobility. If I'm talking about mobility, that means I have to ensure and measure that parents look at it differently, are able to give them space. I'm able to create a system where girls can act as buddies, because it's also questions about safety and physical safety. So I say, great, they're giving permission, but what about a physical safety? So there's a buddy system happening. It's also about, then I measured that. So how many people are willing to? Am I able to break caste barriers with that? So is a girl from a higher caste and a lower caste going to go together? Are higher caste boys willing to accept lower caste girls and not physically abuse them? So all of these questions start coming in, of race, of caste, of gender, and how do I start looking at it? And it has to be done at the very initial planning stage. So when you start the vision of outcome mapping, when you do outcome mapping, you're also planning for what you're going to do ahead. So by default, your monitoring framework and your evaluation framework, your monitoring framework is intrinsically part of your planning process. Sorry. So, yeah. And so it's not, so in outcome mapping, the biggest problem and the biggest critique that people give, and we were doing this for 2 years and it drove us crazy, was how do I put a time to it? How do I decide that today you're going to challenge patriarchy? How do I know that the first time you get up and talk to your father is challenging patriarchy, or you going out is challenging patriarchy? How do I do that? How do I know that the boy who cries for the first time is challenging patriarchy? So how do I time this, and how do I then measure it? Which is his problem, which is his biggest critique. But it is not that you can't do it. It's about, are we willing to look at change and measurement in that aspect? Does measurement mean I have to be able to give a time-boundedness to it? Was the fact that after 4 years the girls filled up the form a big change or not? And if I was going to put it in time-boundedness, they failed. But if you look at it at a more structural level of inequity, as Emily pointed out, then it's about much, much more. And that's what outcome mapping is talking about. And so what they talk about is, and traditionally in monitoring and evaluation, is what you have indicators that measure change. So when you pointed out the percentage of girls who marry before 16 or 18 is what you call your indicator. It tells you that's your code of measurement, or significance of measurement. Over here they say, we're not going to count with indicators. What I'm going to measure is called progress markers. I'm marking my progress. And so by default, I can change it and move it. If I know that I have come this much ahead, I don't have to keep measuring myself from behind of it. I can measure myself from here. And maybe I didn't expect, but I moved in the right. So now I'll measure myself from this. Why do I measure myself only straight? Because that's how your change is, and that's how progress is. And you need to be flexible as in a model. And you need to have those spaces. And the best part about outcome mapping, so is because it's community-centric, is looking at informal structures of power very strongly. It does not talk only about formal structures, and which is why it gets sticky in measurement. And so it is pushed for the community to do it. And now it is going to have, like anyone, I know next question that usually comes is that, but will it work? But it's about how inclusive are you of the community to make it work. So all of that is in place. So if you're talking about just having a dominant group sitting there and developing it, it's not going to work at all. As in any understanding, you have to understand the structures of power, get in people from all the groups, and then work on it. And that's pretty much how all participatory methods are. So any questions on outcome mapping? In the interest of time, I'm running. Any thoughts on it? Do you think it's worth it? I'm a big proponent of this. So you're going to hear only good things from me.
Well, it seems like it is maybe more time consuming, but ultimately what you get out of it is so much broader and deeper with so many more people involved that could be very useful.
Yeah. And actually you captured it. I forgot to say thanks. But it is very time consuming, and you should be willing to invest that kind of time. So if it can't be something that's very strongly funder driven, unless it's very nicely funder driven, because you can't have time lengths that catches you and squeezes you in your neck, because you can't deliver like that. Community processes are slower. And that's intrinsically a problem with all of them. And that actually gets us to participatory approach, which is like theory of change, a much broader topic. And I think you might have, I'm not sure how many of you have done participatory research. It draws a lot out of participatory research. And it looks at pretty much having the community at the center of your entire process or at parts of your process. So it can be adapted and used with a variety of methods and frameworks. So for instance, you might have a log frame, which a lot of multilateral and bilateral organizations do have. So for instance, have you heard of organizations like CARE International, Oxfam, and a world of all of them? But they also use participatory approaches in them. So they might have a log frame to capture, but sometimes when you're doing an evaluation, I might talk to a community, work with certain specific participatory tools to understand change and let them measure the change. And the central tenet of participatory approach is that the process of measurement is a process of power. Anyone who has and knows numbers are pretty much there. And so the community is always at a disadvantage in that. And what participatory approach says is that let's put the community at the center and let's measure what they want to measure and let's measure it in their terms. So if you're interested, there's a lot of work that's done and a lot of work has been adapted into M&E from the PRA. There's a participatory rural appraisal, which was drawn from a lot of Dr. Chambers' work and ODI's work. So they would be a good place to start off with. So,
Wait, go back to that. Tell us a little bit about that picture with all those.
okay. I'll tell you both, okay. These are all stories that I love saying. So this was when we were talking about, so we wanted to do, it was the first stage that we used, we adapted a part of participatory approach into outcome mapping. So the one that you saw before. So before that, you wanted to emphasize, so if you're talking about an issue, I'm coming with it to you. You don't have it. For you, it is not in your center. Like monitoring and evaluation was never in your center of what we were talking. Similarly, in early child marriage was never in the thought of the community. So what you did over here is use a participatory method where you're talking to them about what is the root causes of marriage and early child marriage. And we wanted to talk about root causes of early child marriage. It went into the root causes of marriage for the community. And they're actually using this method where they were discussing in groups and then writing down, each of them wrote down one main cause that they thought. So there's something that talks about, I can hardly read here, but I kind of, so for young people, what are the concerns? For family, what are the concerns? How is it about sexuality? Is marriage really an option for us or not? And so, interestingly, this work is still going on back home, but they moved the entire discourse from where we understand it more about child marriage into talking about, let's talk about it as marriage and not child marriage. Why do we keep on forgetting we're talking about marriage? We keep putting it under the guise of child. So if she's 18 and a half, which is the legal age in India, 18, if it's 18 and a half or 16 and a half, but the girl doesn't want to get married, what is that then? Where does that fall? She doesn't have the choice, she's not giving her consent, but she's married off. Why aren't we talking about that? Why aren't we talking about the 16 and a half who's married? You just forget because she's married, it's done. But the question is, what about all of them? How do we talk? It's more about a question of marriage. How do we understand marriage? How do you structure marriage? So this became an entire discourse on that. And so what came out in your outcome mapping was actually a conversation about how does this community and the communities we work in, how does the society look in marriage? And actually one of the groups, so you do something in outcome mapping first, it's called visioning. You vision how you want the world to be. And then you vision where you say, what is it, how is it I'm going to do, what am I going to do? One of the groups actually said, a world where everyone has a feminist perspective. Which was quite, and this is a group which is interior, I have to tell you the background which will make it even more, which is from an extremely conservative religious community group. And in rural India, this group of women were like, only then the world will change. And it was really interesting the way they looked at it. And it takes a lot of guts to put that in writing, and they actually did. Like we were like, are you sure feminist? But no, that's how it's going to be. But that came out of this exercise. So participatory approaches that way is really good. So there's a lot even in participatory statistics if you're interested. If you think quantifiable is important, there are ways you can do participatory statistics with communities at the same time not alienate them from the process. So it's not just about filling up survey forms, there are other ways you can do it. It's just about how willing am I to rethink how I understand and do things. I keep doing things in my own comfort zone, or am I going to put myself in their feet, in their shoes and fit it in their comfort zone? So it's about how much am I willing to push myself, because that's the difficult part. The community is willing to come if you're willing to push. And this was again an interesting conversation, which is in North India, in an extremely patriarchal society where if a guy walks by, everyone will cover their faces, where caste system is a major issue. I think all of you know about caste system in India. So it's a major issue. And here they're all talking about sex and sexuality open over there with all of us, which is something that my own friends don't do. So it takes a lot to do that. And this is because you started off in a conversation, started off with songs and dance, and then you have those conversations, and communities are willing to engage if you are willing to give them the time and the space and talk it in language that they understand. And let them lead the conversation, because that's where they wanted to go eventually. So these were just broadly the frameworks we looked at. Any questions? Anything? Because I'm nearly done. I just want to show a fun video before I leave for like 30 seconds, if you don't mind.
One thing I'm getting though is that oftentimes funders are still caught up in the causal framework, and that's easy for them to understand because it's so familiar. A more participatory outcome mapping or contribution framework seems so interesting and so useful, and yet it's maybe, what's your view? Are there a lot of funders who have bought into that, or is it still more towards the causal side?
The causal side has a lot of, there's no doubt on that. But there's an for the last 5 years or 10 years, you can add on that, there's been an increasing space of participatory research within it. Outcome mapping, there's something called outcome harvesting that's coming out, there's processual, all of that are evolving newer tools. But the amount of investment you're willing to do in it is much higher. So not all funders are for it. But mixing participatory approaches with a log frame and with a theory of change happens. And a theory of change, though causal, if you are willing to use it and if you go with a feminist understanding, you can still expand and use it. It is not as limiting. Even a log frame actually has been adapted a lot, but it's about how do you understand change and how do you look at development, which is more important than even these frameworks and where you're coming from. Yes?
That was sort of my point when I said your measure of success is the number of girls married before 18. It's like, that's a measure, but there are pieces that go with it. You know, did they marry someone who was 78 years old? Did they, you know, I mean, it isn't a measure of success, it's a measure. And it needs context. It needs context. It can't be that simple. That was the only reason I said measure of success. It's a measure.
Yeah, but it's cited as a measure of success. That's the sad part of it. And I totally agree with you on that.
It needs context. It needs a little bit more than that.
But hopefully with the movement away from the management side of M&E, where there was in between a major push, still is for RBM, which is result-based management, which I just glossed over, which just looks at numbers, which just means filling up forms and giving. Then all you would do is look at this as a measure of success. But if you start expanding it, which is what is being looked at, that's the sad part.
I still see it as a measure.
I know, I totally get it. I don't even see it as a measure. I don't think it's valid if you don't talk about choice and consent, irrespective of the age. So just about participatory approach, because I love participatory approach. I just thought I wanted to show you this quick song to leave on a lighter note. And
how it goes. 1, 2, 3, and all I'm saying, let's give love a chance.
All I'm saying, let's get love and
All I'm saying,
let's get love and joy.
all I'm saying,
All I'm saying,
all I'm saying.
let's get love and चार चराग तेरे बरन हमें साथ
Love it.
ना नमरी
Everybody's talking
was just about, let's talk the same, we speak different languages, so let's talk the same language. Thank you.
What a